Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roger Westcombe, and on behalf of the Director and Council of International House, I welcome you warmly to this 7th Walter Westman Lecture on Science, Humanity and the Environment. I acknowledge, first of all, the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. This series of lectures is named in honour of a founding resident of International House. Walter Westman was an American resident of International House in 1967. Subsequently, he held academic positions at the University of Queensland, the University of California, Los Angeles, and worked for the US Senate, for NASA, and at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory in California. In a lifespan of just 45 years, he made a distinguished contribution to the fields of ecology, geography, and environmental policy in the US and internationally. Walter's 1977 article in the journal Science, entitled "How Much Are Nature's Services Worth?", continues to be influential. It's cited in Hayden Washington's recent Human Dependence on Nature, and a few months ago, the organising committee for this lecture were pleased to receive an unsolicited letter from a Professor Philippe Bavier in New York, which said in part, "We view his work, him being Walter Westman, as a fundamental forerunner of the current movement related to ecosystem services." In a number of the other articles that will appear in the next few months, we will explain in detail how forward-thinking Westman was on his work on nature's services. Meanwhile, back at the farm at International House, we remember Walter particularly because he had the global perspective, the broad intelligence, and the humanitarian orientation that epitomise what is best in an International House resident and alumnus. This led him to receive our Alumni Award for Achievement in 1988. Walter would very much have enjoyed hearing tonight's speaker. Professor Peter Newman is the Director of Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute. He's a lead author for transport in the International Panel on Climate Change. His books include Green Urbanism in Asia, 2013, Resilient Cities Responding to Peak Oil and Climate Change, 2009, Green Urbanism Down Under, 2009, and as co-author, Sustainability and Cities Overcoming Automobile Dependence, 1999. In 2001 to 3, he directed the production of Western Australia's sustainability strategy. In 2006 to 7, he was a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the University of Virginia. In 2011, he was awarded the Sydney Luca Medal by the Planning Institute of Australia, New South Wales, for his contribution to the science and practice of town planning in Australia. And just this year, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for his contribution to urban design and sustainable transport, particularly in relation to saving and rebuilding Perth's rail system. Tonight, he will speak on the subject, Sustainability from Despair to Hope. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much. I too acknowledge the traditional owners. I would also like to acknowledge Walter Westman. He was a a terrific person. In those late 60s, I was at International House in University of New South Wales. And it was a very apocalyptic time, and the birth pangs of the ecological environmental science movement, which I was very much part of, and the people who were leading us out of the modernist view that somehow you didn't have to bother about those things took it pretty hard, and he was clearly one of the leaders. So I'm going to talk about hope. Let me also acknowledge Keith Suter here tonight, who's been one of the great sources of public academic reflections on these kind of topics, particularly having a sort of theological bent from despair to hope. Sustainability came on the scene from the 90s when it was seen that we needed a different approach that brought together the different disciplines of environmental things, of economic things and of social things, and that we could no longer do them separately. They had to be joined, integrated, and that was going to be a very difficult process, but we needed to expand that area in the middle. I've been part of that ever since, both at university in setting up a sustainability institute in the late 80s, in fact, and then at Curtin, where we now have 80-odd PhD students in our CUSP Institute. We get remarkable people who, coming from all kinds of backgrounds and disciplines, who recognise they need to integrate and find a new approach. They're reinventing themselves as professionals. But we've been through an era where there's a lot of curves like this, you know, going up exponentially and looking as though they're out of control. Depletion, disappearance, despoilation, degradation, any number of things could be put into that curve, and they look as though we have no chance. And what I want to talk about are the R curves, which are how we can begin to repair, renew, renovate, restore, turning it around, looking at curves that are starting to go down. And even thinking about how we could regenerate, that we could be doing more good than bad. We are not just minimising the destruction or minimising the footprint, we are actually repairing and regenerating. So there is a movement now to talk about regenerative cities. So regenerative cities are seen to be moving on from sustainable cities, so that we are actually creating wealth associated with this whole regeneration process. That's the theory. Most people think, well, come on, you're dreaming. This is crazy. Especially when you look at these kind of curves, where you've got, in the climate change arena, periods of history that we just haven't experienced, where we are heading up into an impact on the globe that is really concerning. And we have to get 80% less CO2 by 2050, and yet that curve keeps going up. So the way ahead is to create a turnaround like that. This is the only curve that will see us have any kind of sensible future as a civilization. We cannot possibly go like this. By the end of the century, there'd be 11, 12 metres of sea level rise. These are all the options that we're looking at. The 450 is the one that the UN is committed to, and saying no more than 2 degrees centigrade rise could occur. And that will require these kind of mixtures of policies that would be completely new. Current policies are just going to keep going like that. We've got to get to this scenario. It means we've got to turn over. We've got to have curves that start going down. And when you're in that phase where things are going up still here, you look to the future, it's very hard to predict trends other than that one. So most of even the IPCC reports, they're based on the science, so that means you've got to get the data, and the data all points to something like this that is very hard to get off. So how do we look to the future? And can we have any kind of hope about it? Climate change is certainly happening, and we're in a situation where it just seems hopeless. Some people actually say the problem is GDP itself, and there's quite a lot written about this, and you can sense what this is saying, that the only hope is degrowth, because at the moment, growth means pollution. It means that there is more fossil fuels. Every time we grow, we get more fossil fuels, and that's the problem. So Tim Jackson and others have these approach prosperity without growth. And I think it's important to resurrect GDP for a start. It is actually just measuring our activity, particularly the money side of things, and not everything can be measured that way. We know that. Even our own families and so on, you know, not everything's dependent on money, but money is important, particularly for those who don't have much. And poverty is not a great thing. It is certainly not a great thing for the environment either. But can we actually make economic activity involving money and do it in a way that decouples that growth from fossil fuel use? That's the big question. The United Nations have all kinds of committees and things working on this decoupling now. Or is the only hope that we just have to shrink our wealth and become poorer? Now, the fundamental ideas in this presentation tonight are based on this economic wave theory, which is essentially saying that we've been through periods of growth and then decline, and we come out of it with a whole set of new technologies, new approaches, new businesses, new kinds of ways of building our cities. And the era we're in now is somewhere here, where we are coming out of this fifth wave, which is based on digital networks, and it will build on that, and everything in that will be needed. And we're creating a new kind of green economy based on sustainability, radical resource productivity, whole system design, biomimicry, green chemistry, industrial ecology, renewable energy, green nanotechnology. These are the things that are being invented today that will shape our future. We are no longer in that era. The fourth wave is the one of oil and coal, even further back. But both of them are old technologies, old ways of doing things. And the big question is, can we create growth out of that in a way that creates what's called green growth or green economy, create a better future, and yet not have those impacts? So the OECD, UNEP have this green growth, and there's a lot of documents now. What type of growth can generate both wealth and well-being for all citizens of current and future generations, while at the same time respecting the environment? So the idea is that we need to enable extreme poverty reduction. The new Sustainable Development Goals, which are coming out, they're being decided this month from the UN Assembly. There'll be 10 goals. The first one is to end extreme poverty. And then it goes into 80% less CO2 by 2050 and those kind of climate change goals as well. So they must be decoupled. And the reality is emerging economies do need to increase their wealth levels, and the whole world is going to be depending on how well they do it, how differently they do it, whether they can show us how to decouple, because we've done it the other way. So what I want to show you is the green economy happening? Are we going over that curve where GDP is increasing, the footprint's going down, and we are decoupling wealth and fossil fuels? the main message is this, that when you're going up this curve, the green economy struggles because you're working against the market. The market's been set by the previous waves, previous technologies, ways of doing things, the regulatory frameworks and so on. And it's like you're adding something on that's difficult. And it's hard. But then, as you go over the top, the green market starts to thrive, the green economy market, because it's now working, it's decoupled. You're creating wealth and the footprint is going down rapidly. So you've got an opportunity to have the market working for you. Now, the big question for me is, are we actually at that point where we can see the decoupling and perhaps see a different future emerging because we are going over that curve? So where are we on the curve? Now, the first data has come out to suggest the peaking is beginning. Instead of it going up, it's starting to level off our greenhouse gas. This is a Dutch report that's just come out. And what I want to do is look behind this at some of the individual trends that are happening. Firstly, about coal. It seems to be peaking, the consumption of coal, due to peak fossil fuel power investment, which occurred in 2008, and peak power consumption, which also occurred in 2008. And the second thing, that oil is peaking due to peak car use, which happened in 2004, and peak conventional oil production in 2006. So my sense is GDP is decoupling from these two fossil fuels anyway, and they're the main ones. Now, the Australian didn't do us a great deal of help in its last few years, where every day there was an article suggesting that King Coal was alive and well and needed to be supported. When you actually look at the data, and we did this not so long ago, brown is the investment by the banks of the world in power stations based on fossil fuels. Green is power that is being generated from renewables. That's the investment in it. So we're talking about what are the investment sources of the world doing about the future. They are choosing renewables. They are phasing out coal. So in 2008, it reached 50-50, and since then, we've been getting a higher and higher proportion of renewables. It peaked. Fossil fuel investment for power consumption peaked and is going down. A few key reasons. The price of solar energy has been dramatically coming down, and it is pretty much around grid parity now. It's even beyond that. You see, today was, in fact, we're in the middle of that, near that 2015. Mainly because of what the Chinese did in mass production, and we've all benefited from that. So the new investment in clean energy by sector is showing what is that. So blue is wind, yellow is solar. So the solar part of that has taken a lot of the investment in recent years, and biofuels is small. So wind is still doing okay. These are, real billions of dollars being invested globally, but the big one is solar. But then we've also had that there's less need for power now, because most of the world's economies, apart from the emerging ones, peaked in the early part of this century. This is the UK, about 2004. They peaked in power in their households, in industry. Basically, they're just getting more efficient. All of those technologies, those stars on our washing machines and fridges and so on, they're getting cleverer and clever. We just don't need as much power. So you can see how clearly in the UK the GDP kept going up. So it is decoupling. We're getting cleverer at how we use power, and at the same time getting wealthier. Same thing happened in Australia. In 2008 we peaked. started going down. Still, that's pretty old now, but it's continued to go down. Now, this really took the utilities by surprise. It shouldn't have. They were told about it, but they planned, like most economists would have said, you know, it's going to keep going like that. That's what it's been. Why wouldn't it keep going? We're getting wealthier, so we need more power. No. It's decoupling. And you can see it in detail. The carbon tax certainly had an effect. Over the top, as the CO2 levels began to go down relating to the national electricity market, and in fact the GDP or greenhouse gas to GDP ratios going down. So we're getting more GDP, less GHG, and it's pretty rapid decline. Now, each city has been building up their solar operations, but not because utilities are doing it, because households are doing it. Now, this is in Perth. But we've done the maps on each Australian city, it's pretty much the same. The outer suburbs are where the PVs are being bought. Now, the little houses of the inner areas, it's a bit harder to fit them on. We can't seem to manage to get them on our house. There's just not enough room. But the outer suburbs, and they generally are poorer in Australian cities. This is their attempt to manage their energy future, and it's having a big effect. So in Perth now, 10% of homes have PVs on their roof, and it's growing, it's still growing. That's about 310 megawatts in Perth, which is a substantial power station. So in the last 2 summers, we've got nowhere near the peak level that was seen to be the problem, because previous years you'd get brownouts because everyone puts on their air conditioners and so on when they get home, and out it goes. We got nowhere near it. We weren't even 30% under it or something like that, because the PVs are out there pouring their energy into the system just as you need it. And so it is an emerging system that's here, and Western Power now are talking about how their grid is going to be kind of secondary to the new power systems that are emerging, where neighbourhoods and houses together will be relatively self-sufficient, but with a backup. So there's about 2,000 per month adding to this at the moment. Individual houses are doing lots too. Now, Josh Boone, who is well known, he's the on Gardening Australia every Saturday night. He's on our staff at CUSP. He's got a 3-year position recently, and he's built these 2 houses in a middle suburb, Hilton, part of Fremantle, and he built them 10 stars. Now, you have to build houses today at 6 stars, but he did 10 stars, but he built it at $1,200 per square metre, which is a very reasonable rate. And they're fairly ordinary houses, but very nice, but entirely based on solar passive design. No air conditioning, no double glazing even. He's got PVs on the roof and solar water heater, and he's got his garden. But he and his wife and his 2 kids are in this house, and it's fully monitored. We've got all these wires going everywhere, and he puts it all on the website, Josh's house. When he first planned it, this was the carbon footprint of a typical Australian house. This is the embodied energy saved, operational carbon saved, solar panels. They expected to have a small carbon footprint, and they've just done the first results. Kabam! Sorry about that. Did I do that? I won't do that again, I assure you. Firstly, the usage and costs of water. You can see the Perth average and a tiny little bit. Now, he's got grey water recycling, he's got collecting rainwater, he's got all kind of pumps going everywhere. In fact, about 1/3 of his electricity is pumps to get And, oh yeah, this is the electricity costs after including the PV exported to the grid, tiny little bit. When you actually turn it into greenhouse gases, because there's a difference in the cost at different times of the day, you can see he's actually creating more energy than he's consuming in renewable terms. So he is actually regenerating. He's putting more renewable energy back into the grid than energy he's consuming. And it's a very livable house. So the yellow line is the summer heat temperature. The temperature of the inside the house, it rarely goes much above 25, 26 or down below 23. And in winter, no heating, that's the outside temperatures, that's the temperature in the house. So it's a very livable house. Now all of this is on the Josh's House website. He's got all of the designs and documentation of how he built it available, and he's had 10 million visits to this site. Huge interest. People can see this is just an ordinary house with an ordinary family, and they're regenerating. So the next thing we're going to do is put batteries in, because batteries are coming down in cost. Lithium-ion batteries, similar to the PVs. So they're going to be attached to the house so that during the day, when the sun is out, it can be stored in the battery, and then when you come home at night, you can use that, and that's based on your PVs rather than the peak hour costing, which is a higher rate. So you'll save even more money and energy. And then you link in the electric vehicle to it as well, and you can see how you can begin to affect your transport as well and make it more renewable. What about Highrise? That's that was just an ordinary suburban house. The Highrise, this is a new building just gone up in Perth. It's called Stella. Department of Housing built it. It comes from a group called Hickory, and they are a Melbourne group that are now setting up in Perth and in China. They have their 9th generation set of buildings now off-site manufactured. They're highly clever. They use all the digital techniques. They use amazing things they've learned from automotive engineering, which is very fortunate because a lot of automotive engineers are now available for employment. And the building is very beautifully designed. Every building is different, but it is off-site manufactured, and then you just wheel it in and plug it together, and it took 11 days to build. Instead of being an impact on the surroundings, it becomes a spectator sport. People love to watch. So let me just show you what happened in 11 days in a little bit quicker time. I'm trying to find that. I can't see it. So 20% less cost, 40% less carbon, 50% less time, 80% less waste. And people love it. This is the kind of technology and breakthroughs that we're starting to see. You can see why it is we can decouple. What about China? Everybody says, we're getting smart, but the Chinese are ruining everything. They're now the biggest polluters in the world, and on all the expectations of the need for GDP to grow to a certain level before you start being clever about things, you'd expect the Chinese, they're about $7,000 per capita now, you've got to get up to around 15 or so before you start to be sensible. That's the traditional model. Well, it's very interesting to see. Aren't they building a coal-fired power station every week? You heard that myth? No. This is what's happened in China. Look at that red line. It's peaked. Coal consumption has peaked. It is starting to decline, in fact. The latest numbers are just a little less than was there before. And their 5-year plan they're on now is to phase out coal-fired power stations. They're taking down the coal-fired power stations around Beijing, the ones that are causing the air pollution. They have banned any further coal-fired power stations. And it's part of a global process. The US has banned any further coal-fired power stations. The EU has banned any. The World Bank has. They're done. And the GDP is not faltering. They are still growing in their wealth, but they are not growing in coal. So you can see the growth rate in the GDP has dropped a bit. It was 12%, you know. It's gone down to 8% or so. But the coal consumption is down to zero in its growth. And it affects everything. So their whole approach is now to phase out those big, dirty industries. Basic industry and thermal power generation that goes with it is all going down. And you can see the annual power additions to their grid, increasingly hydro, wind, solar, and a little bit of nuclear there. What does it mean for Australia, particularly the East Coast that exports so much coal? Well, it's going down. China's coal imports have dropped for the first time. And we've heard, I think it was today, wasn't it, that there was, or maybe it was yesterday, an announcement that they were not going to receive any more dirty coal. Australia would say, oh, ours is not dirty, but we'll see what it means. But I don't think there's a lot of hope for any big coal deposits to be opened up, especially ones owned by certain politicians. And it's likely to be a very different future emerge than the ones where they tried desperately to, you know, get on board with this revolution that was happening in China. More coal, finished. We can breathe a sigh of relief about that. And they can too. It's quite a remarkable turnaround. So we're now talking about stranded assets. There's a group called Carbon Tracker that is suggesting to the world's investors that they have to get very serious about stranded assets. So coal-fired power stations, certainly, but some utilities that are based on that are going to be in real trouble. Giles Parkinson's written a lot about the death spiral, which is related to this fact that the coal is going to phase out. In Western Australia, there's been one written about the whole grid becoming the first victim of the death spiral, because we are still heavily subsidising our grid. It's not privatised. And so the state government pays $500 million a year to keep fossil fuel power stations going, many of which are not even being used. So it's pretty silly. And that is certainly going to get worse. The decline of coal is setting in rapidly. What about the decline of oil? Peak car use, I should have predicted. We've written about this, we've collected data on, you know, this is our book from 1999, and we've got 100 cities in our study, and look at this, that's the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the growth in car use. But in the 90s, it dropped right away, a whole decade of only 5% growth in the world, in the 100 cities we studied. We should have seen that it was going to go down here, but we didn't. It's a bit hard to take it in. Actual declines in car use? Well, it did happen. The Americans were the first to see it. So 2004, peak car use happened, and it started going down quite rapidly. Now that was when oil hit $80 a barrel. And it clearly is related to that, because it happened around the world. Now you can see the more recent data shows it's still going down It's back to what it was in 1994. Right across Europe, the same thing. Japan actually peaked even before that period. And in all Australian cities, the same year, 2004, we peaked in car use per capita. In every Australian city. This is Canberra, the car city of Australia's world. No congestion causing that. And down the bottom is Sydney. But all of them peaked at that time. The transport planners have still not seen this, or if they have seen it, they don't want to believe it. Because this is not the way it's meant to be. It's meant to just keep going up. And you've got to plan for that and build the roads to fit it. Sydney's traffic is back to where it was in 1992. Mightn't feel like it. There's certain coming in from the airport tonight I didn't notice. But peak times are a bit peakier than they were, but the overall levels are down considerably and keep going down. And yet you've got the biggest road project in Sydney's history about to be launched. Stranded assets, because they're supposed to make money. You know that the tunnels that we've been building have all become stranded assets and those companies have gone bankrupt. Well, I don't think we're going to do much better. Now, why is this happening? It's happening amongst young people mostly. This is in America, where the teenagers, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all have significantly less car use per capita. And then it starts to peak until you get into us baby boomers up here, and we're driving more. We're never going to get out of our cars. My conclusion is we'll drive ourselves to our own funerals. This is because there's increasing numbers of them. And you can see it's right into the 80s, it's still going up. I remember getting my first car and the freedom and the connection that was then possible. But you don't need a car to get that anymore, because everywhere in the world, people are on these devices connecting. This is how, and the surveys in America show the same thing. People value their mobile phone more than a car, and younger people especially. So if you go in a bus or a train, you can keep doing all this and you're connecting to everybody. You can't do it while you're driving. You go to jail some places. And the increasing road accidents, of course. I was talking to a cyclist the other day who keeps data on this, because, you know, as you cycle, you're right next to people and you can see them doing this. There's a desperate need to keep in touch with people and to do all your Facebook and stuff and to get your messages. My wife has a go at for me for whenever my phone goes off and I try to do something with it while driving. But it is a lot easier when you're in a bus or a train. And that is increasingly... Well, you can even do it while riding a bike, I suppose. I haven't tried. So around the world, this century has seen a dramatic turnaround in public transport. I spent 20 or 30 years trying to help cities hang on to whatever public transport they had. And now it's just booming. And the problem is not to get people in public transport. There's already too many. They're already full. In Perth, train after train goes past people on platforms now because they're full. That's so hard to have imagined when we were fighting to save the railway. And it's the same in all of these areas. The US, Australia, Canada, Europe, Asia. Tremendous in Asia. 82 Chinese cities. It's actually up to 86, the latest number I just saw. Building metros. Dramatically building them too. And the high-speed rail is happening very quickly. 46 Indian cities. There was only 12 and then there was 16. Now there's 46. Could be a little competition going on there, but the new Indian Prime Minister has announced that cities down to 1 million can now apply for funds to build metros. And most of the Middle Eastern cities are building metros. This is the Dubai one, and you can go to the Highrise by train these days. Saudi Arabia is spending $1 trillion on a rail system right across their country. They must know what's going on with oil. Now, Jeff Kenworthy, who's my colleague in this, has done some recent data which shows this is GDP, passenger kilometres per unit of GDP. So people are driving less and getting more wealthy. So in each of these areas, we are decoupling wealth from transport. This is GDP per passenger kilometre, and it's just improving all the time. In the US, this is their latest way of looking to the future. They've recognised this. We still haven't. We can't come to terms with it, so all our predictions are still saying traffic's going to go up. They're showing that the vehicle miles per unit of GDP is going down. And the cities that are showing it most, like Washington DC and Portland, are the cities with good rail systems. If you've got good rail, you're going to get wealthier and you're going to have less cars. It's very clear. So places like Portland, this is a private tram that's been built as part of a new development. Very, very popular. And people love to live in Portland because of it, especially young people. London, central London, financial capital of the world, 19% the traffic fell in this century, and you can see that it is not just that congestion tax that came in, that's some time ago. It is part of the knowledge economy that that jobs in that area are going to dense centres with walkable environments and good transit. It is, the more cars you're going to have there, the less money is going to be made there. So it's decoupling. So what about China? Aren't they ruining the world with oil as well? Have a look at Shanghai. You can see the dramatic change here in 20 years. And they did start to build highways, and there's a fair few of them around in China. But they fairly rapidly filled. And what do you do when you get to that stage? There's no more room. They're very dense cities. So what they did was start building metros. And Shanghai was the first, and Beijing followed, and they've had a competition on. They now have the 2 biggest metros in the world. Shanghai has 88 million people a day using their metro. A day. And Beijing has pipped it, they've gone up to 9. And you can see the size of the metro system. Extraordinary. In a decade they built it. From nothing. And the total metro length right across the country, it's a 5-year plan. So West Australian Iron Ore is going into something good. It is building these metros. And they're fantastic. They're beautiful train systems, and they are packed. Everyone has immediately gone into using it. So this is the data on Beijing. Back in 1986, 5% of people used a car. And then it rapidly moved into the cars, but now it's coming back. It's actually peaked. The big drop was going from walking and cycling here down, and that has mainly gone into these metros. So the metros now taking 42% of the transport task. It's a dramatic turnaround, and all in a short period. They also have a lot of transportation demand management, as it's called, in Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Hangzhou and Tianjin. All have vehicle quotas. There are only a certain number of vehicles allowed in. and they have licence plate controls. So days when you're allowed to drive and not allowed to drive. The big thing, I went to China for the first time really this year, and Jan and I went across from Shanghai to Beijing and then out to Xi'an by the very fast trains, the high-speed rail. And it is beautiful, 300 kilometres an hour average speed. They started building that system in 2007 and they've now got 8,538 kilometres. Every city has these 15 platforms of high-speed trains all lined up, and it's like a massive airport going into it, very highly managed, and it is extraordinary how it's taken away from oil-driven transport. And it works. It's better. It's decoupling. So what's driving these reductions? First of all, we have peaked in conventional oil, 2006, and this is the new oil that's being found now from fracking, from deep water, from burning rocks like tar sands, and it's all very expensive. So we have some more. It's not a lot. This actually was a graph put out by the Bureau of Transport and Research. This is a famous report because it got withdrawn. A bit too close to the bone, that, showing something going over and down the other side. Surely we've got to have that. When you see the International Energy Agency reports, they all do show that going up like that. They just have to. It's the only way we can cope with it. And they have all kinds of crazy things stuck in the middle to make it go up. The only thing that's really going up are likely to be the costs. If we keep depending on oil, it's going to get more and more expensive. So we've got to get through a phase where oil becomes cheap again because we don't need it, the same way we have with coal, and it's probably going to happen. But these are all the different sources of oil from different other ways, even gas to liquids and coal to liquids. They're very expensive. The latest information on stranded assets is suggesting that the oil and gas industry and their fracking is really leading to a substantial bubble that's going to burst. So there's been massive increases in, this is the residential construction, and it's going down, and coming up, taking most of the investment, is oil and gas. And it's leading, this guy is saying, to a bubble. The epicentre of irrational behaviour across global markets has moved to the fossil fuel complex of oil, gas and coal. This is where investors have been throwing the most good money after bad. They are likely to be left holding a clutch of worthless projects as renewable technology sweeps in below radar and the Washington-Beijing axis embraces a greener agenda. So stranded assets. This is the map of Sydney, showing the vampire map, which is the areas which are most at risk from increases in price of oil. And you can see why the northwest and the southwest had substantial commitments to build rail out there, because the green areas are where the rail goes. And they have about half as much car use as those suburbs. And in here, the wealthy have something like 1/10 of the car use of those outer suburbs. So these are some suburbs in America that were abandoned during the GFC and are still abandoned. They are so far away from any kind of services, you have to drive. And you just can't afford to. Mortgages are threatened by the amount of driving you have to do. We'll get to that stage too. So obviously auto manufacturers are at risk, and I think we've done the right thing to get out of it. Unless you're building electric vehicles. For some reason we didn't take that on. But suburbs that are completely automobile dependent, and some of them are still being built, will be stranded. And what about airlines? Here's some data. This is the cost of oil, cost of aviation fuel to Qantas. These are the other costs. This is the price of oil, which has been a bit static there, but been going up right through that period. This is Qantas's profit on the top, which you can see just dipped a bit at the end there. Nobody's blaming the price of fuel much, are they? It's all about management styles and things. But there's an underlying structural problem there. And airlines have got to come to terms with this. The growth of airlines has been dramatic. Where's it going? China could see. They've got their fast trains. Japan could see it 30 years ago. And the first oil crisis when they started building their high-speed rail. So high-speed rail's off the agenda. Utopia had a wonderful spoof on it. It was all about me. Made it feel like it anyway. But it was, it is easy to laugh at that because it is expensive, but we're going to need it. So how quickly can we change? I'm going to finish on this. Basically, if we look again at this, the market's struggling there, it's thriving there, and what it means at that past the critical point is that the very different futures begin to emerge. You can predict differently when you're on the other side of that curve. It looks very different. It's like you've been coming up the mountainside here. You can't see the other side, but from the top you can see something very different. And as you come down, it's even clearer. So the decoupling is emerging, and we've got the possibility of thinking and believing in a different kind of future. So here's some examples of some figures. If you look at the growth rates that are still happening in renewables, that's it there. This is wind, this is solar, this is batteries. And it's likely to go like that. Batteries that link into EVs as well as household energy use. So the overall picture can be like this. This is oil. I reckon it's going to go a bit sooner than that. This is coal. This is gas, still going up for a while. Transition fuel. This is renewables. Nuclear, pretty much the same. This is renewables. That's the kind of growth we can expect. So when you see that, the overall story for CO2 is like that. Dramatic reductions. If you take that further out to 2050, you've got 80% pretty easily done. Now, you couldn't possibly have seen that, and the IPCC's reports don't show that there's anything more than scary possibilities, because it's hard to predict. But this is very different. So what can stop it? Heavily subsidising the old fourth wave industries, and we still do, but we could keep, we could try and save them. Regulations that prevent the green economy market from emerging, and there's still quite a lot of them. And wars, they don't help this transition at all. So let's hope we can get over all of them, but the biggest one of all is fear. Thanks very much.
Open for questions.
It's great to have something positive, but I have a problem with the fact that it seems to me in Australia, but particularly in Sydney and New South Wales, we've stopped talking about sustainability. We talk about climate change, but we don't situate climate change in sustainability. And in fact, in the latest planning tools they're bringing out in New South Wales, they don't mention sustainability. So why do you think that's happened? You talk about it.
I'm a professor of sustainability.
Why aren't they listening to it?
Yeah, well look, it's the same everywhere in Australia at the moment. The word's been banned, and public servants pick that up pretty quickly. The S word's off, don't use it. The clever ones get around it by using all kinds of other words, and they achieve the same thing. So I don't mind, as long as they recognise that this is a global word that is going to be reinvented over and over, and from next year the Sustainable Development Goals will be the commitment for every nation to try to reach, and we will have to report on it, and every company, every government, every high school, every household ought to be looking at how they are achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not going to go away. I found in China the use of the word sustainability was very powerful. I loved it, you know, and this is representing their new kind of future they're trying to reinvent. Now, there's a long history of politicians trying to ban the word sustainability. It began with Ronald Reagan, and my story that I tell about this is that Nancy had a dream, and in this dream it said that the United Nations was evil. Now you've heard that theory before about 666 and all that, but she actually had a dream about it, and she said to Ronald, we've got to get out of the United Nations. Now this is a story that came from a State Department official. The President that went to the State Department and said, what are we doing with the United Nations at the moment? And he said, well, we're on the Brundtland Commission, the World Commission on Environment and Development. He says, right, immediately withdraw the American delegation. So they took out their 2 Americans who were on that, and they banned the word sustainable development from that time. Now, I reckon you can trace the decline of the American empire to that period, because they led the environmental revolution. The Walter Whitmans of this world were fantastic. They were the leaders. Paul Ehrlich and so on, extraordinary people that showed us how to go. But more than that, American technology for cleaning up things, American regulations, the EPAs of the world, are all based on the American model. We've not looked to them since. All of the innovation, the leadership shifted to Canada, to Europe, to Japan, even to Australia at that time. Certainly the Scandinavians. And they've been playing catch up ever since. It's never quite worked for them. So words do matter. And, you know, especially when they've got a political driver to it. Now, I did the sustainability strategy with Jeff Gallup for our state, and he's very proud of that now. He takes it around to Africa to show them how you should do one and all this. But he was taken over by another Labor person, Alan Carpenter, who immediately banned it. Said, I don't want to hear about sustainability. It was just a like offhand thing, as though we want to get on with the real things, health, education, security, whatever, but not sustainability. And so, you know, the reports were all taken down, but put it in the bottom drawer, because they're still around. It doesn't go away. The ideas are real and useful, and they are helping to define our futures. So every now and then you find it coming back again. Tony Abbott certainly banned it, and to me it's totally irrelevant that the politicians are doing that kind of performance. It is unstoppable, this process, especially when you see that the market is driving this now. So take heart, use the word, it'll come back in, and people will start to say, well, yeah, we should have always been doing it. But we come and, you know, we go on these cycles, and in the long term, we'll look back and say, well, this was the sustainability era. And some of us embraced it and some didn't.
You're talking about cities. What about Australia as a
you know, with all its space, how are the rural areas going to deal with it?
Yeah, it's another topic, and it's one that I'm no great expert on. I've been a cities person. It's where the majority of growth is happening across the world, both in population and in economic terms. The world economy is driven by cities now. So that's what I've focused on. But clearly they have to become sustainable too, and that works in every part of agriculture, of forestry, of fishing, of soil management, of biodiversity management. They've all got to be part of this. And cities, the best cities are those that embrace their hinterlands, their bioregions, and together work out a regenerative process. So that, because you can't just be a city. It's a city and it's hinterland. And they need to be in partnership. They can't do without each other. And I've certainly written books about it. The Resilient Cities book and the Cities as Sustainable Ecosystems is about bioregions. But the driver, the really important things for this decoupling process are happening in cities.
I've been to a lot of these seminars and topics. In all seriousness, yours is one of the first to actually have an optimistic outlook on it.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
I'm really confused.
I have been accused of being an optimist, and that has seemed to be derogatory. You know, academics are not meant to be optimistic. You know, you're supposed to be, oh, the world. You know, I've seen where it's going, and it's not good. Sorry.
I'm intrigued just to hear your explanation as to why you can see so much optimism when so many of your peers can't see it.
Okay, I have a little story. I worked with Professor Paul Ehrlich, who was the great champion of the environment. He came to Australia and it was riveting, his analysis of the world. So I went and worked with him in the early 70s at Stanford, and he is a complete, total pessimist. And he had there was no potential for human society to survive, and the only thing he could do was not have children and essentially just try to hunker down and, you know, make it through. But essentially he had a biological view of the world. He didn't have any other kind of view to integrate. It was not a sustainability view. It was purely biological. And I was talking to Sarah before about James Lovelock. He's got a similar biological view. And I don't think it really reaches to the heart of the matter, certainly not to human beings. Now, I have studied theology, and I find that sort of theological perspective that brings hope out as a deeper thing to relate to, that as a deeper value, that despair and fear are very negative. So I found that in reading the prophets and so on, that you can see, they don't just say you're doomed, they say you're doomed unless you change, and then Babylon can go and Zion will appear. There are always city images in the Old Testament. So that affected me. And what I found was that in the first few years as a lecturer in environmental science at Murdoch, I was trying to get people to be really scared, not just a little bit scared. I was just going to scare everybody into action, you know? That was the idea. But I found it didn't work. They were just scared and they stopped. It was like, it's beyond us, we can't do anything. And so I switched. And part of it was because I started this campaign to save the railways, and I won. So it was like, oh, that's not meant to happen. It's supposed to be all downhill. But in fact, when you got a hopeful message out there about a different future, people jumped on board and loved it. And we kept winning and winning and winning. Now, when you've do that, you start to realise that perhaps hope is a better message. So I made a significant shift in my own approach to students, to lecturing, to the research projects we took on, to undergird them with hope. We got 80 PhD students trying to show there is hope by doing differently what we do now. And it's a far better way to live. Now I may be proved to be a completely nutty, idealistic optimist, and that in fact I should have just been more realistic and recognised it's all going down the tubes. But it's a lot more fun this way. Right, Keith, and then you.
I'm following on from this issue of fear. I think that one of the issues that I come across in the environment base is that people are fearing their loss of jobs, such as in the coal industry, etc. Is your research centre looking at all the new jobs that can be opened up in the green market economy and add to this, to your message of hope? There are plenty of employment opportunities there.
Yeah. We don't. For some reason, we've hardly got anyone in the renewables area. We've got one American working with Chevron who wants to switch. He wants to jump ship and do a PhD on renewables. And he's got all the skills to help us on that. But I think the best researcher is still Mark Diesendorf. He's been doing it since the 60s. It's extraordinary. He's now got a model of how we can become 100% renewable. It's not that hard, and it's clearly happening. It's just a question of how quickly. And he's really battled to show that. But in every part of the analysis, he shows that there's more jobs, not less.
We all know most of renewable energies are intermittent, so basically it depends on the wind or the sun.
Not all of them, but
yeah.
some of them, yeah.
So what would it take for the government to add incentives on such technologies as thermal energy storage? Similar to carbon tax or something like that. What does it take to move the government to actually invest in such technology?
Yeah, storage is the holy grail with renewables, but for a start, grids act as a storage to a certain degree. In Germany and Denmark, they're up to 40% renewables now, and the grid is coping with it. So it takes it in and uses it in ways that clever control systems can manage. And the overall 40%, I mean, there's not much sun at night, and wind is coming and going, but so there is intermittency. But grids are able to absorb a lot and distribute it when it's coming on and not when it's not. That's one thing. The second thing is batteries, which I think are going to be the next wave, and which will mean you won't need the very big scale storage. This is going with solar mostly, and they are coming down in exactly the same kind of curve we saw on PVs. So this is lithium-ion batteries, the kind of thing in this computer, and they are increasingly available. So we're finding that our Department of Housing, for example, is looking to put them into the houses that they're putting PVs in now. That will mean poor people will essentially be able to live without having an electricity bill. That's a fantastic goal to have. The big-scale storage systems, the solar thermal ones with molten salt and this kind of thing, they're still pretty experimental and they're very expensive. I don't know where it's going, but my sense is that we're not going to be going big scale, we're going to be going small scale. And the more we can fit around small scale storage, the better it'll be. And the missing link is electric vehicles. Because if you've got an electric vehicle and a whole neighbourhood of them, not only do you have batteries in your house, but you've got the batteries sitting there in your car, And so when the wind's blowing and the sun's out, it's going into the vehicle, and then when it's not, you can actually take it out. It's a very substantial battery system that's just sitting there unused otherwise. So why not join it in? It's called vehicle to grid, and it's got a long-term future for sure. We need to have smart grids to be able to manage that, and smart metering and all of that. And that's happening very quickly now. So I think we can solve the storage problem without going to the big scale options, but maybe big industries are going to need it. Let's see, but at the moment, let's take what we've got, and they're all small scale. Yeah.
I hear that the general public are pretty keen on the notion of renewable power, and I work a bit with young people who tell me about their despair that us grown-ups are frying their planet. And what you've got here is a good news story, a positive story. So how would you say we can get that message out into the wider community?
Well, I think I'm only just seeing it myself, being able to look over the mountain and down the other side. I've kind of pushed it before, but I can really only just start to see those widening gaps. I'm going to do a TEDx on October the 4th. Hopefully it'll do well, and we can get that out to the odd 50 million. It's a wonderful thing, the way in which social media sends around good stories. So that's one way to do it, but I'm sure there's a lot of other people who are going to crack onto this soon, because the future shouldn't be so despairing, and we've been through a pretty dark time, and it's time to overcome that, and I'm sure I'm not the only person pushing it. There was one other over there, yeah. Just this one first. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you looked at the impact of these things on the economy and the impact of the economy on this. So if oil becomes too expensive, then you can expect that's going to have a big impact on the economy, and if we had economic downturn, what is that going to do to this land? But also what can we do in Australia now that we can see that the things we've been making money from are not going to make us stop.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thinking we've got to go through, and the tools are available now to analyse in terms of how much carbon there is in your food you're eating or the car you're buying or whatever, and I think we'll increasingly have those tools. But you can imagine that electric vehicles cost about $1 a night to refuel, okay? So $5 or $6 a week. They're going to put oil out of business. Oil's going to become so cheap you won't know, because it'll not be needed anymore. That's the way it's going. So like coal, it's not because it's too expensive that it's being phased out, it's because it's not needed anymore. It is the wrong fuel. So the stranded assets are associated with coal, whose price is going down, and that's going to happen with oil too. And there's going to be, and we're seeing the trend to public transport and so on, and people coming back in. So the oil companies are worried, and you see all the ads at the moment for cars are about young people having really cool times together. Basically, they set up their own little movie on a dead freeway somewhere, and they all drive to it and have fun. It's like a desperate attempt to try and hold on to something cultural, but they've lost. So I see the trends in the economy being positive, because those things are dying. They've taken a while to die, and we don't need them because the alternatives are there, and they're all going to be needing engineers and scientists and economists and project managers, all the people we employ now, but they'll be doing these green things. You'll be employed in it, don't worry. Down here.
One of the peaks that you did not say by name was demand. You illustrated that efficiency of appliances is driving this, or has caused this peak. You did show a picture of a vehicle full of people with phones. Mm. I've heard that the cyber industry is going to be using up more power, well, enormous amounts of power compared to what we are using already. That doesn't seem to be factored into the decrease in demand that you indicated.
Yeah, well...
Am I wrong? Is the cyber industry...
You know, there's an awful lot of cyber around. We've all got our computers and mobile phones and we plug them in at night, but power is going down. So I don't think it can be too much. There certainly can be substantial in some firms with very big computer needs. It's a big part of their costs. I think the computers and the mobile phones, they're just getting cleverer and cleverer. I can't see any end to it, you know, they're just amazingly clever. And that kind of thinking then goes into all kinds of industrial processes that make them more and more efficient. That building industry stuff, that's all based on computers and little tablets that people walk around to check how the processes are going, and very clever, and all the design, the creativity comes in early stages, but you then control it, and there's almost no waste in that process. But they're they certainly depend on the digital, the cyber world. If it was really energy intensive, they wouldn't be doing that. So my sense is that it's going to be quite small as a proportion. And around the world, the declines in demand are setting in. They're really going down quite fast. The utilities are really scared. They want you to get out there and consume like a good red-blooded Australian instead of this silly stuff. Efficiency, conservation, goodness me, you're going to ruin the world.
Peter, I'm going to take over at this point, and on behalf of a very appreciative audience, thank you for your message tonight. These things which are outside hard science, but which have to do with humanity and the reactions of human beings, are so powerful. And we've been seeing in recent times that some people get great enthusiasm out of going to war and doing other things like riding bicycles about the place at great pace. But what you've done tonight, without a great deal of obvious evangelical fervour, is to give us a message of real hope and founded on real science. And we're very grateful to it. We're grateful for it. And we'd like to present you with this as a memento or a consolation for your efforts in getting here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen,